Good afternoon. I am Sylvia Argueta, the Executive Director of the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, and welcome to our first ever virtual symposium, The Next 100 Years, Advancing Racial Justice and Empowering Communities. Empowering communities, very important. Very few do this, very few have that calling, but there is one person, one woman, who stands out in my mind, and that is Ms. Lillian Mobley, who has since passed on and joined her ancestors. Ms. Mobley, or Mrs. Mobley, but she was really fondly known as Mother Mobley, was one of the most impactful social activists in South Los Angeles, and I dare say Los Angeles, state, the nation. She helped found the Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital in Watts. She also helped found the Charles Drew Medical Center, LA Southwest College, the Black Women's Forum. But what really Miss Mobley was about was bringing voice to the poor and working people of South Los Angeles, long ignored by those in power. She spoke quietly but firmly and was always humble and never wanted attention to herself. But attention came because there was no other person who could speak truth to power in the way that Miss Mobley did. So as you join us this entire week, think about her, look her up, and get to know this icon of community activism. I am so honored to have known her, and more honored that she was part of the LAFLA board for many years. I hope you enjoy today. Thank you again for joining us, and onward.
Thank you so much for that message, Sylvia, and welcome to everyone who is here for LAFLA's first symposium. My name is Tyler Nicole Smith. I am a staff attorney here at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, working with the Reentry Group, and I will be your moderator today. I'm first going to introduce our panelists, and then I'll talk a little bit about how to send in any questions, should you have any, as we move through. First, I'd like to introduce Yolanda Arias. She is the managing attorney here at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. She is the managing attorney of the Economic Stability Work Group. Next, I would like to introduce Ms. Lynette Jones. She is here representing the LAFLA board, and she is also an in-house counsel with AT&T Entertainment. Next, I would like to introduce Antonio Moore. He is an attorney and founder of the American Descendants of Slavery and host of Tone Talks and producer of the Emmy-nominated documentary Crack in the System on the Iran-Contra and crack epidemic. And finally, I would like to introduce Chris Punonga Bayed. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. I'm so sorry. Chris is the executive director of California Change Lawyers. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I cannot wait to have this conversation on race, race equity, and specifically lawyering. For anybody who has questions as we move through this panel, please feel free to use the Q&A option on Zoom. Toward the end of the panel, we will take a look at that section and answer any questions that are available there. All right. First question. So first thing we want to talk about is racial justice lawyering. And part of that is something called movement lawyering. Movement lawyering, I think, has a very good general definition. Law for Black Lives defines movement lawyering as taking direction from those who are directly impacted, specifically communities and organizers, rather than the traditional lawyering whereby we kind of go in and we flex our legal muscles and we tell them, what the law says about what they can do. Movement lawyering is more about listening. And in part of that, we're kind of interested to know from the panelists, how do you feel racial justice lawyering fits into that movement lawyering definition? Chris, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Tyler, for that introduction, and thank you to the LAFLA team and everyone who made today's event possible. It's really a privilege for me to be able to join during Black History Month and looking forward into the next 100 years. So to get right to the point, I think racial justice lawyering means three things to me. And I'll mention them now, and then I'll talk about them each individually, just to summarize. Racial justice lawyering to me means 1, anti-racism, 2, it means talking about trauma, and 3, it means doing the inner work. So first, on anti-racism. So no original idea here. This is coming from Dr. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But Dr. Kendi says that racism is the hierarchy of human value based on race, and that puts whiteness, or the social construction of whiteness, at the top of the hierarchy. And racism can exist on an individual level, cultural, or what we are familiar with as lawyers through law and policy. And so anti-racism is an action that subverts the hierarchy of human value. Anti-racism is the opposite of racism. And Dr. Kendi points out that the opposite of racism is not being racist. Only anti-racism is the opposite of racism. And so this is important because the central premise of anti-racism is that we are living in a racist society. So if I say, I'm not being racist, that means that I'm not doing the work to dismantle racism. Being not racist is in fact upholding racism. So the only thing that we should do in the face of racism is be anti-racist. And that means acting to dismantle the hierarchy of human value based on race. So transporting these ideas into racial justice lawyering, to me, this means that whether we are in legal aid or we do social justice work or we're doing community lawyering or really any legal practice at all, anti-racist lawyering is lawyering that dismantles the hierarchy of human value based on race. So in the legal aid, poverty law context, whether this is immigration, employment, public benefits, education, these are all opportunities to dismantle the hierarchy of human value based on race. So movement lawyering is just another iteration of this. Movement lawyering creates lasting change. It's driven by community members' voices, and whether it's changing hearts and minds or it's legal wins for the entire community, when it dismantles the hierarchy of human value, it's exemplifying anti-racism. The second thing about racial justice lawyering to me is that it is informed by trauma. And this has two components, the trauma of clients and then the secondary trauma that lawyers vicariously experience. So if you have a client who has experienced or is going through a deportation, an eviction, loss of income, wage theft, a school suspension, incarceration, these are all forms of trauma. So just to repeat what I had said earlier, anti-racist lawyering dismantles the hierarchy of human value. But stating it in the affirmative, anti-racist lawyering means upholding the humanity of all, especially those whose rights have been trampled on. So this means seeing the client as a whole person, not just as a case or a case number or a legal issue. It means understanding that trauma results from these violations of human law because they diminish human dignity. And being aware of trauma and being trained in trauma appropriate responses when practicing law is being anti-racist, is practicing racial justice lawyering. And then one step further is recognizing that secondary trauma is also real and has an impact on lawyers themselves, especially if you come from the same community as those facing the trauma of deportation or wage theft or loss of housing. So just to contextualize this a little bit, we're coming off of 4 years of intense trauma. And a lot of this, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it was rooted in white supremacy. And that threat is still real and ongoing. And this is what results from years and decades of suppressing the truth and the hard facts about racism in America. The Confederate flag was in the US Capitol, and that didn't even happen in the Civil War. So trauma is ongoing. Trauma impacts our clients, but it also impacts us as lawyers. And so we need to be more mindful of how racial justice lawyering includes trauma, acknowledging trauma. And then the last concept that I want to introduce for our discussion and perhaps of value for the rest of the events in this week's symposium is that racial justice lawyering means doing the inner work as individuals to undo the ways in which we have all internalized the racial hierarchy of human value. So last summer, we saw the racial reckoning that is still unfolding in America on the heels of the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many took to the streets. There were so many in our legal community who were standing up, issuing statements, focusing their philanthropy on Black-led organizations, which I think is completely laudable. And what I'm worried about is that that is where it ended. In that, to me, is not doing the inner work. In fact, that work, while important, if it's the only thing you do, is really just a form of virtue signaling. So today, no one gets a pass on being a little racist, because being even a little racist reinforces the hierarchy of human value. Doing the inner work, whether you are white or a person of color, is acknowledging that we live in a racist society and we have all internalized racism, racist notions that flow from this hierarchy of human value. But the good news is that this is not something that any of us are born with. None of us are born with bias, but it's something that we learn, and it's also something that we can unlearn. So the whole field of bias interruption, I think, is an example of doing some of this inner work. Dr. Kendi says that the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. So what is it that we must admit that we have done, either as individuals or as members of society, to uphold the hierarchy of human value based on race? And so therefore we must acknowledge, admit, and atone for whenever we have in our practice or in our lives upheld the hierarchy of human value. And by acting step by step, action by action, within all of our communities, we can work so that racism can be eliminated in our lifetimes. So I'll pause there. That's what racial justice lawyering means to me.
Thank you so much, Chris. That you set the tone for the entire conversation and helped to kind of give us a roadmap of all the things that we're going to talk about today. Lynette, Antonio, is there anything else that you would like to add about what racial justice lawyering means in the context of movement lawyering? I'd love to hear from either of you.
I don't know if Lynette wanted to go first, or I can definitely go last. For me, I kind of look at it in the context of being not just Black, but ADOS, meaning American descendant of slavery. For a long time, I think this group has been forgotten in the sense of, even when we heard the interpreters earlier, so specific about like lost land and lost language, but the group that actually everybody talks about when we come to slavery and Jim Crow and everything alike has largely just been kind of melded into Blackness, then melded into people of color, and in a sense erased in a way. For me, movement lawyering is very specific in the sense of, let me say this, as a criminal defense attorney, I think it's more so what you were exactly talking about, Chris. But then aside from that, as an individual, when I actually look at the work I've done with, whether it be in documentary filmmaking or actually with actually forming American Descendants of Slavery, which has led to the reparations discussion, it's really tied to being an ADOS person and making Black America aware of the consequence of that so that they can begin to try to ask and demand for what is due to them from what has been taken.
And I just want to add to that, that I think my views are along the same lines as Antonio's, where I see movement lawyering and racial justice lawyering in a way, just from a perspective as a Black woman, that what I want to focus on are the things that have traditionally affected Black communities for hundreds of years. And so, yes, there is a hierarchy in our society that typically has shown itself in that Black citizens who are descendants of slaves have been the ones who have primarily received a lot of the injustices that we see in our society. So I focus a lot of my attention on how to identify where the need is in the Black community and what I can do to support those efforts to provide legal services and pro bono services to members of the Black community.
Thank you so much, Lynette. And Yolanda, we've not forgotten about you. I'd love to hear from you as well. You're on mute as well.
So I approach racial justice from my experience as a person of color, but also as an attorney who grew up in legal aid and legal services and built my expertise around health and welfare issues. And we all know that institutional racism is a big problem, and it exists in many facets of people's lives, including health and welfare institutions and policies. So just to add a perspective of where I have my expertise, I mean, public administration of health and welfare policies are rife with institutional racism. When FDR passed the first social safety net programs, they were only accessible to white widows, mainly. And states had control over who got welfare and assistance, and they made that a condition of passing that legislation. So there was very little stigma at that time against welfare recipients. And it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act and Johnson's welfare war on poverty that more people of color were allowed to access benefits. And very quickly, when people of color started accessing those benefits, it became painted as individuals who are lazy or refused to work or were dishonest and wanted to cheat the system, that the stigma of receiving welfare came up. And so, so there's a lot of institutional racism within the area of law where I practice, and racial justice lawyering for me has been dismantling those barriers and overcoming those access issues for all people.
Thank you so much to everybody for your responses to that. Specifically, what has been your motivation to become a movement lawyer, or to even get into this field of racial justice lawyering, or just kind of infusing the way that you lawyer with this idea of race equity. Chris, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I think, when I got out of college, I moved to New York, and I was born and raised in the East Coast. My parents immigrated from the Philippines, and I moved to New York after graduation, and I started getting involved in community work. And it was really when I was in college that my consciousness around racial justice was even kind of brought to light, taking Asian American studies classes for the first time, African American studies classes, and helping to bring ethnic studies to my campus. These were all very politicizing moments for me. But it was really when I started getting involved in community work in New York that I met an organization called the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And they, to me, were kind of the epitome of movement lawyers, because they had folks from the communities that they were ultimately serving as their clients. So whether it was on the issues of domestic workers' rights or immigration or voting rights, they had community members who were lawyers serving that community. And that was kind of like how I learned. I mean, that's what I don't know, maybe naively, I kind of thought that that's what all lawyering was like, because that was what I kind of gravitated to. And it wasn't until I decided to become a lawyer myself that I realized, okay, this is actually a lot harder than it looks. And, our legal education system isn't kind of geared towards supporting this type of practice of movement lawyering or community lawyering. So we all kind of have to, cobble it together. And what really motivates me today in my role at Change Lawyers, where our mission is to build a better justice system for all Californians. And one of the main ways that we do this is by empowering the next generation of legal change makers. I have a lot of access and conversations with people who are moving through legal education today as law students or as recent graduates. And, I hear stories of what they say their experience is, and it's eerily similar to what it was 20 years ago when I started law school, that being a person of color in law school is a very isolating experience. It feels like you're being gaslighted all the time. And this, to me, is a calling for all of us to do better for the next generation, right? I have the privilege at Change Lawyers to be kind of building the bench of the next generation of LAFLA attorneys and, in-house folks and public defenders. But we can't take it for granted that they are going to make it through and succeed. We need to continue to invest in them and to change the legal education system, and then more broadly, our profession. Because right now, even in a state as diverse as California, which is 60% people of color, only 30% of our profession are people of color. 60% of the population are people of color in the state, but only 30% are attorneys of color. So we have a long way to go in having the state reflect, the state's legal profession reflecting the great diversity of the state, because it's not just, a matter of more representation. I mean, that is important, but diversity in and of itself is not the goal. The goal is a more racially equitable legal system and society. And by increasing the success of young attorneys of color and attorneys of color in general, we'll be making great steps towards building more confidence that the legal system will treat everyone fairly, regardless of their identity. And really, we're really far from that now. So we have this is our calling. This is my calling. And I hope it's your calling as well, that we start to do the things that will transform the face of our profession, so that we can see that promise of justice for all really ring true.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. As you were talking, I was kind of thinking back to something Lynette said at the end of the last question, specifically having to do with Black people. And I was thinking about my own motivation for wanting to get into this specific area of law, being that I wanted to make sure that people saw attorneys that look like them at these service organizations, so that they have somebody who has a better understanding of them and of their struggles, but also to address those issues within the Black community, which is where we don't really see a lot of people who look like us in these spaces. So I wanted to know from either Lynette or Antonio if your motivation stems from something similar or if it's completely different.
Oh, Lynette, go ahead first. I went first last time.
Well, I can tell you that, based on my background, so when I was younger, we lived in the projects. We were on public assistance. We had food stamps. I know that we were able to transcend from that because there was someone who was there to help us. And so a lot of what motivated me to get started providing pro bono services in the first place was just coming from a place of poverty and being unrepresented in terms of not having an economic foundation that I think it affords most people the opportunity to hire a lawyer. That was my initial motivation. And then as I began to work within the community while I was in law school, it's when I began to learn about certain injustices like wage theft. Just something I wasn't really aware of as a young person, but as I started to work in the nonprofit sector, I started to realize that there are certain communities that are more affected by that. And I started to learn a lot more about the power structures that create those types of situations, and I wanted to learn more about it. But as time went on and as I became a lawyer, I started to see that the more volunteering I did, the fewer Black lawyers I saw, especially when it came to assisting Black community constituents. And so, when you talk about racial justice lawyering, it doesn't mean that I'm not providing legal services when I volunteer for the entire community. It's just that there are certain places where I feel there's a greater need. And so that's the motivation now for me to direct my attention towards Black communities.
Antonio?
Yeah, I think as a Black male, speaking to a different set of information that I think just got missed is we moved to a point, I believe, that we got fatigue about Black males. It's interesting. I watched LA 92 in preparation for this and just remembering everything because I was young. LA 92 being the documentary on the riots and what led to the riots, the strife between Koreans and Blacks, so many different parts of it. But in that moment, we were focused like lasers on Black men. And I believe over the last 25 to 30 years with the introduction of intersectionalism and other factors of looking at sex as well, sexuality, we decided Black men are okay. They're just men. But none of the numbers actually supported that. So one of the things that kind of triggered me was I started to dig into something that I still think I don't understand why it doesn't get covered massively. The pure numbers of Black men that are incarcerated. Right now in America, there are more Black men incarcerated than all women on the planet. All. And the thing that's happened is we as Americans have kind of accepted that and not even dealt with why is that the case if we all live in the same communities. Then we look at Lori Loughlin and she gets out despite doing multiple high-level crimes that cross state lines. For me, that kind of triggered an awareness of why is this happening? How is this group doing these crimes? And I started to realize these are poverty crimes and wanting to explain then to Black folks, why are you impoverished? Well, when I did that for Black folks, they asked me, what's the solution? Well, ultimately, with the scale of debt and the scale of wealth that white folks now have, and I've covered this on my shows, you've come to the only solution being reparations, a reparative justice movement for ADOS people specifically, a Black agenda for Black folks at large. We have one on ADOS101.com. And what I think started to happen is the imagination of Black folks themselves started to awaken. Because when I started the project, nobody even thought about, like on a mass national level, reparations as a word. Now we're in the middle of it and people don't really understand where this trigger point came from. Well, it kind of came out of this imaginative moment of what is movement lawyering, what is the responsibility of getting a legal education, how do you weaponize that, not only against the system, but also against what Chris pointed to earlier, internal familial misunderstandings of the differences of opportunities between generations. And what I started to see is that Black boomers in Los Angeles don't understand the difference between their lives and Black boomers, say, in Atlanta, where their houses did not triple in price. You know, Black boomers in Los Angeles don't understand your children don't have the same opportunities as you. ADOS people, even in Los Angeles, recently I've explained, I talked to you guys as host about this. They did a Color of Wealth report. They showed that the middle native Black family, which is primarily ADOS families, is worth $200 liquid. Color of Wealth done by UCLA and Duke, $200 liquid, the middle ADOS family. Well, the middle Nigerian family is worth, West African family is worth $70,000 liquid. I wanted to explain how is this all happening, why is it happening, and how do we move forward about changing some of the dynamics. What that ultimately led to is the reparations bill that you saw in the California actually signed into law recently. I testified as a lead expert. That actually originated in part from my show. An intern watched my show and I actually interviewed her on my channel. And then instead of using her hours generally, she laser focused when she went down to the Senate and said, I want to talk about reparations. This is what it looks like from ADOS 101. This is how we want to do it. And that led to a reparations bill like we've never seen before. I believe if that's possible with no billionaire behind us, with no funding, anything is possible if we start using our legal educations to advance that kind of, I guess, imaginative politics.
Thank you. This question is more, I guess, toward Chris and Yolanda. What are some barriers that that you faced as in being an effective movement or racial justice lawyer? And I guess we can start with you, Yolanda.
So as an attorney that works at an organization that is dependent on government funding and other sources of funding, a lot of the barriers are obviously shortage of resources, financial resources and other resources, because it takes a lot of community involvement, being out in the community to listen to our neighbors and community members. So that does take a lot of resources, and we're always struggling with finding enough funding to go out and do that. So that's one barrier. The other barrier, along with some of that government funding, comes restrictions. We can't do grassroots organizing. We can't do lobbying. So we have to be very creative in finding ways to be able to have that impact and be out in the community to do the listening, and then also help with the strategies development and implementation. So I would say the biggest barriers are shortage of resources and funding restrictions.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I'll just tag on a little bit around the government funding issue. And I think it maybe does trickle over into other sources of revenue. But for many organizations that are legal aid organizations, government funding is kind of a double-edged sword, because there may be a lot of it, but there's also a lot of deliverables that I guess I would say are not trauma informed, right? Because if you are committed to a certain number of cases without a recognition of how much time it actually takes to do a single case, then it impedes legal aid lawyers from doing some of the more transformative work, because each individual case has to be, we have to meet the monthly deliverables for the government contracts, whether it's county or state or federal or city level or whatever it is. So there's something about the nature of the way legal aid is funded that I think not just the restrictions, but even just the way that it's often a volume-based practice that I think impedes movement lawyering. And then the second thing that I will add kind of relates to the practitioners, which is related to the debt burden that many young lawyers graduate with, because the cost of legal education today, even in public legal education, is just incredible. We recently did a survey of our alumni. These are folks who have received Change Lawyers scholarships. We have two different scholarship programs for first-year law students and third-year law students. And our team was looking at it and was just, our jaws dropped when we saw $250,000 in debt after college and law school loans put together. And if you come from an impacted community and you really want to serve the community, but you have this $250,000 price tag, on you, with no great programs out there to support public service loan forgiveness or loan repayment assistance programs from your law school, the debt burden forces certain career choices. And I think that's siphoning off people who would otherwise give back to their community. So I think we do need to look kind of at a structural level on the debt burden and solutions that may be out there, because they are driving people into a certain type of legal practice, and that shouldn't be the case.
Thank you, Chris. I can definitely agree with that as somebody with tons of student loan debt from law school. Making the choice to go into public service rather than going into private practice was a difficult one. And I think it's very difficult really for young attorneys of color to make that decision right out of law school, because you're thinking about, I have all of this stuff I have to pay, I can take a few years to do this and then I'll come back. And then ultimately they never make their way back. I don't know if Yolanda, Lynette, or Antonio, if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Not really. I took a bit of a different approach. I was a non-traditional student, so I worked full time. I went to school in the evening, and I knew going into it that I had to make some very astute financial decisions about how I was going to manage debt while I was in law school. So my being an evening student meant that I was in law school for 4 years. And so I had some other financial responsibilities to balance. So for me, I knew early on, it was drilled into my head early on that I needed to manage my debt while I was in law school. And I also needed to figure out what my plan of action was going to be after law school. So I think sometimes what we don't have is a lot of education for students early on about what the decision to go to law school really means and how much debt they are truly going to incur, and encourage them to come up with a plan of action and a deadline for trying to manage that debt. I think because some people who go into law school are just completely unaware of what it means to manage the amount of loans that they are taking out. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars for some people. Unless they have the tools to manage that, what you end up with is, some people graduating and having over $500,000 in debt. And it's just unmanageable. It's untenable for a lot of people when they're trying to make decisions day to day about how to pay rent and how to eat, because a job as a lawyer is not an easy one to find. I think those are the kinds of things that I think as a legal community, we need to step back and make sure that if we're mentoring students, we're doing a holistic mentorship and talking to students, not just about what it means to become a lawyer and working in public interest law, but what it also means to manage the debt that we're incurring or that they're going to incur when they decide to go to law school.
Tyler, I want to add something. I went to college and law school at a time when there were very progressive policies with regard to tuition assistance and affirmative action. And I was very, very fortunate that I wasn't saddled with that huge student debt. And unfortunately, our policies around tuition assistance and affirmative action, they were so successful that people wanted to put the brakes, people in power wanted to put the brakes on that progressive type of policy. And so we reversed ourselves, which was very unfortunate. And now we hear, our current administration our politicians, our more progressive politicians, once again talking about free tuition and student loan debt relief. And I think we're headed in the right direction there, but we started and stopped, and we now need to move forward again.
Antonio?
I wanted to add to that briefly. When I look at that question about what is some of the issues you face, I would have took it in a different direction, but staying in the same line of thought, I think the other thing that's starting to happen is, as lawyers, we have logical minds. We played inference games when we actually did our test, but this isn't a logical time in the sense that you look at one thing, like as an example, to go to exactly what Yolanda said. Education is up 1,500% since 78. The cost of education, 1,500%. Well, in addition, white America has went from holding $25 trillion of wealth in 90 to having 100 now. And they're in the middle of transferring that wealth to their millennials, who are basically law school grads, or if not in their law school career. And what we have as a result is a calcification of so many professions that were introduced to us, especially as Black folk, through the Cosby Show, through Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, through popular culture. And a lot of us planned for a career that they decided to shift, a set of careers, whether it be doctor, lawyer, everything else. And so, we have this dynamic world where massive wealth is being handed from families. And I think it's only calcifying the ability to enter into these professions, because these amounts that Chris brought up, they exist for a reason, because white families are paying dollars. Not all of them, but like a good chunk pay cash at Loyola Law School, at USC Law School.
Very true. Thank you so much for that. I kind of want to move us into kind of talking about the 1992 uprisings and kind of what we learned from that, and kind of what we can learn from that, still learn from that as we move forward. So as I'm sure many people know, the 92 riots were sparked most notably by the beating of Rodney King. Additionally, the murder of Latasha Harkins, as well as the verdicts that came down from those cases. My first question for all of the panelists, who I believe were around during that time, I was not. What factors or dynamics do you believe contributed to that uprising? And let's start with Antonio.
I kind of look at it and I break it down into race, immigration, wealth, and then mass incarceration. Now, some of those things overlap. We start with race. This was a Black-white America up until like the 50s, and really well past the 50s into the 60s. When you look at the Smithsonian has a data point that before 1960, the amount of Black immigrants that were in America were to the right of the decimal of the overall Black population. So basically everybody was ADOS. And we moved from that until now, where out of 46 million, they say now Black folk, 10 million are Black immigrants or their children, and 36 million are ADOS. That's a very different world. The same thing happened, I think, in Los Angeles and across America, where we moved and transitioned so fast after the Immigration Act, from a world of being Black and white to a world that had Koreans, that had different sets of Latinos, that had Indians, that had all kinds of people. And we never did any dialogue of what that meant. And LA was sort of the melting pot of that. And so like what you ended up with is this issue where you see it with the Harlan's case, where this store owner shoots this woman in the back of her head or in her back, let me say, I don't know the exact location, but what ends up happening is they find her guilty, but the judge gives her community service. There's no Black man that would have got community service for killing someone in that way. Then you turn around and you have Rodney King, who is beaten like an animal in the street, and then there's no repercussions. Well, you see this reality of like race and immigration, and then even during the riots, I remember being here in Los Angeles. I was very young, and you saw this transition from it being a black-white issue to it being a black-white Latino issue to it being a black-white Latino Asian issue over the course of a set of 3 to 4 days. And when we talk about even black Asian, it wasn't even necessarily involving white folks. It was about black folks going back to the Harlan case and feeling like you guys own these stores and don't treat us with any respect in our neighborhoods. And I think that when you start looking at that in context of what I talked about with wealth, you start having a better understanding. I interviewed Thomas Shapiro of who came up with the term racial wealth gap with Melvin Oliver in the book Black Wealth, White Wealth. What he said is that before the 90s, there was no wealth data. We just had income. So people, particularly black folks, did not know that white folks had all the wealth. Now you add that into the fact of what I said earlier about the wealth levels, they didn't even have the wealth they have now where they added $100 trillion. So I add all that in and we had this melting pot in Los Angeles. But at the same time, we had Tom Bradley as a mayor. So we had Tom Bradley as a mayor. At the same time, we had the rise of Ladera Heights. I did my documentary, Freeway Cracking the System. That was with Freeway Rick Ross. At the center of it is the Iran-Contra scandal, which melds into this whole set of issues whereby the government, what we showed in the documentary, we went and got the Nicaraguans, first time they've ever been on camera. Many of them said that John Kerry couldn't find us, Maxine Waters couldn't find us. This is our first time on camera. It was on Al Jazeera, nominated for Emmy. What they begin to show is a complicity in the sales of crack cocaine that led to mass incarceration at a scale like the nation had never been seen. You had Black young boys going to jail for poverty crimes, for small levels of cocaine, of crack rocks, 5 rocks, getting the sentence that you should give high-end drug traffickers that are trafficking in cocaine. 100 to 1, I think, was the disparity. Then in the backdrop, and I'm kind of blending everything, is Reaganomics. Reaganomics is stifling the ghetto. Trickle down isn't working. You have Reagan saying the DARE program, you have LA on fire, and then they militarize the police. Daryl Gates is able to come through with tanks into Black communities. You had the perfect melting pot when you added race and immigration and mass incarceration for people to have this explosion. And I think 92 represented that. Now we add in the last sprinkle, which is hip hop had given us a lens. I just interviewed Ice Cube, I think a week ago, and he and NWA had voiced F the police, the whole message that, you know, people were being mistreated all across not only Los Angeles, America, Black people, Black boys, Black men. And I think, you know, that uprising has led to a kind of awareness that we didn't have before. And I'll let everybody else speak because there's one other aspect, which is technology, which allowed us to see racism for the first time in a way that you can't really get when somebody tells you about it. You know, I tell you about it, I got beat by the police and you see me beaten in the face, you always kind of say, especially when it comes to a Black man, what did you do? Well, with Rodney King, because this guy had this $3,000 camera somehow, all of a sudden we got the images that we get from cell phones for the first time. And we had to confront that Black men are not always violent or they're not standing up. Sometimes and oftentimes and too often they're beaten on the ground just because they're Black and they're male. Or they're shot down because they're Black and they're female in the case of Harlan's.
So I'll just add this. During the 1992 uprising, I was still in college. And honestly, I have to say what we had to deal with last summer and the Rodney King beating and what we witnessed in 1992, to me, we haven't made much progress. The reason I say that is that it's the same type of thing, but instead of beating someone, people are being choked out, they're being shot. Those are the things that you're seeing on camera. And we're still getting, unfortunately, we're still having the same kinds of results when it comes to, you know, police officers being held accountable. I think when you look at all of this injustice in a broader perspective, and I'm sorry if my connection is interrupted. I think you have to also look at the way children are being treated in schools. I think you also have to look at the way the homeless population is being treated. They're being beaten, they're being killed by police officers. So that's the reason I say I don't know if that much progress has been made when you look at the systemic problems holistically.
Thank you, Lynette. And we are going to talk about kind of what similarities you guys see between those 1992 riots and what we kind of experienced last year and following into this year in just a moment. I did want to give Yolanda and Chris a chance to respond to this question as well about, you know, what you think contributed to the 1992 uprising.
I think I'll go ahead. It was definitely anger and being able to witness firsthand, well, not firsthand, but at least being able to see the actual events. But it was a carryover also from 1965, the anger that things were just as bad, and that no progress had been made, and that you know, these law enforcement officers were able to do such horrible things and get away with it, and there was no accountability. So I think that largely contributed to the uprising, you know, the anger and the frustration that things really had not changed.
Thank you. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I'll just speak quickly about kind of the immigration issue. You know, ditto to what everyone else has already said, but I think it reflects a failure of US immigration policy with regard to immigrant integration. And that's still the case today. Unfortunately, anti-Black racism is alive and well in not just in mainstream America, but also in immigrant communities as well. And there's not, I think, enough done to help immigrants who are new to the country, who are still learning English, about what the history of race and racism is in America. And that, I think, is still the case today. Many, you know, recent immigrants from Asian countries and elsewhere still don't understand the fact that the law that Antonio referenced in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act, came about as a result of the civil rights movement. That, you know, we were trying to uphold an image of America as the democratic home for all. And the laws changed, you know, with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and so on. But the Immigration and Nationality Act came about because of the activism of people who believed America could be the home for anyone. But people who did come after 1965, you know, weren't given the resources to be able to understand the dynamics that they had come into. So I'll just point to that because I think the consequences of that are still, we're still living with.
And let me add one last thing to that, Chris, and that is part of the failure of not having ADOS. Because what started to happen is this dynamic where we created Black and a group, say you're Nigerian and then you're Mexican, you guys both just came, but somehow because you're in the Black category, you are connected to American slavery, Jim Crow, everything that came in before Lyndon Johnson decided to let affirmative action happen. And both groups were just as confused about the experience of being a multi-generational American descendant of slavery and Jim Crow. And I think all of that confusion kind of boiled over when we saw what we saw in 92, because you had literally, and I'm not saying it was mass scale, but you had Korean shop owners having shootouts with Blacks and Latinos on the streets of Los Angeles. And there is one last element that we allude to, but a lot of people don't like to talk about, which is Daryl Gates, it felt like, was sending a message of what a policeless Los Angeles looks like. So the decision comes down, and a lot of the from Maxine Waters to Tom Bradley, they spoke out against the decision, meaning the decision to basically acquit the officers. They spoke out against the police and the activities against Rodney King. And it felt like what Daryl Gates was trying to show is this is what your city looks like without police, without National Guard. And it took a long time, if people remember, when I say a long time, several days too long for the response of police. And we saw what we saw. I think it was 1,000 structures were burnt down.
Yes, and that is true. And for anybody who wants additional information or would like to kind of get some more background on this, the documentary that Antonio mentioned earlier, LA92, which is both on Hulu and Netflix, does give you a really good overview of exactly what we're talking about, specifically that the statement or inference by Mr. Gates that, this is what your cities will look like if you don't have police and you don't have this militarization of police that we obviously see today. That is much more of a problem that we could have a whole separate discussion on. But I will move forward and I'll just ask Yolanda this quickly. In the aftermath of the uprising in '92, I know that you specifically had a role in kind of going out into the communities and working with the communities. Can you give us some idea of how LAFLA was involved and kind of what it took to gain the trust of those citizens who were obviously so distrustful of the justice system as it was? Can you give us a little bit of perspective on that?
Sure. So in 1992, as we are now, our LAFLA offices were in the communities. We had an office in South LA, we had an office in East LA, we had an office downtown, Pico Union area. And so we were in the low-income communities, and we had fostered relationships with the communities through our work, especially with our work in the housing developments with the tenant organizations. We were constantly working at Nickerson Gardens, at Jordan Downs, at Imperial Court. I worked personally with the developments here in East LA, Estrada Courts and Maravilla, and Ramona Gardens. That was part of what LAFLA did. We went out into the community. We had a home ownership unit that worked with low-income homeowners. So the community knew us, and we worked with a wide swath of the community, not just in the housing developments, but throughout the community. So they knew us. And during the uprising, leaders in the community counted on us to be there with them. So when demonstrators were planning to go out to protest at the LAPD headquarters, they called our attorneys, our advocates at LAFLA, because they expected us to be there and be standing with them. And our attorneys did go and observe what was going on because, our restrictions and stuff, but we wanted to be present for our community members. So after the uprising had destroyed these buildings, we knew that we had, that we were part of the community, that we had the trust of the community. Our building on Manchester and Broadway, right in the center of the destruction, was not touched, even though buildings around us were destroyed. One of the community leaders called one of our South LA attorneys and said, just so you know, LAFLA is safe. That was, we took that as an indication that the community respected us and trusted us, and we were important. We were an important factor in the community. So as a result of the uprising, the power was out, there were fires, so a lot of the community markets or little stores were burnt down. Food was not accessible because the power was out. a lot of the people had their food spoiled. So those, and because I'm coming from my perspective of what I did, what I worked on, I'm talking about the need for emergency food stamps at that point, because like I said, people didn't have access to food. They had, food spoil. So the federal government, the Federal Administrative Agency in charge of food stamps at that time, would not release emergency food stamps. They didn't see an uprising and the destruction that occurred as a result as the type of a disaster or emergency that they were used to dealing with, like earthquakes and wildfires and floods. So they weren't prepared or willing to release emergency food stamps under these circumstances. So LAFLA, along with the ACLU and Western Center, sued the federal government to get those emergency food stamps released. And we were very successful. We got the administration to issue those emergency food stamps. And like I said, this is just an example of the type of work that LAFLA was doing. And because that's what I was involved in, that was my experience. But we were out there in the community helping the cleanup, making sure that we were addressing whatever needs the community had that we could address. And I was very happy that I was able to play a role in my small way of helping the community.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for your work on that and for answering that for us. We only have about 15 minutes before we're gonna start answering questions. So I'm just gonna issue kind of one last question, and Lynette kind of touched on this a little bit in this last question, but specifically, what parallels do you see between the uprising of the 1960s and 1992 and the current movement that we're going through now? I know Lynette was saying that, very little has changed, specifically that we can still see, people being shot and killed and beaten on camera. And we can see the criminal justice system at play or not at play. And we're still seeing this idea that, for lack of better words, that Black lives are less significant than everyone else's. So can anybody kind of speak to what parallels you see between those previous uprisings and what we're seeing today with the Black Lives Matter movement? Antonio, you can go ahead and start us off.
Yeah, so the parallels, of course, are oppression. I mean, you basically have a dominant group, primarily white homeowners, that dominate like wealth holdings, politics, everything else. I think that the interesting part is to invert that and look at the differences, because I think one of the things that happened is technology, first and foremost, and this is what I was speaking to earlier, significantly changed the way we interpret that oppression. Technology first, in its expansive ability to tell us more detailed information about the difference in opportunity, from wealth to education and the like. That's Google and all the ability to look into data. But more importantly, the visual nature, reminds me a lot of Selma and what Dr. King was able to do with Bloody Summer. The Bloody Summer is that you were able to expose people now to the actual image of George Floyd from different image angles by people recording with their phone in a way that prior to Rodney King, it was almost impossible. And as a result, that technological jump that we saw forced people, particularly white people, to confront the cost of their advantage and what it meant for them to have so much while other people had so little. Now, particularly when it comes to ADOS, I come back to one of the significant changes that we cannot understate is immigration and how it introduced a voluntarily immigrated population into the discussion. So it's a vast difference to be brought here in slave chains and then cut out of opportunity and then never given reparations and then put knee to neck versus voluntarily coming to America and then being oppressed. Now, I think the impressions are both wrong, don't get me wrong, but there's a vast difference. And I think that additional element, especially as you come forward to the George Floyd era, you start seeing that. Now, George Floyd, Rodney King, and everyone from the 60s, all were ADOS as I understand it, so they all experienced the same thing. But I think generally speaking, if we move beyond just George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we look to some of the protesters that we've seen here in Los Angeles walking the streets, we ended up with a very different visual image as well. We started to get this multicultural, if not white dominant in some places, protest group that was vastly different visually than what we had seen in the 60s. And I think as a result, it led to a different empathetic, like understanding and awareness. Because even though they called Black Lives Matter, a lot of the shirts were on white folk. It was just what we saw. You know, I'll let everybody else chime in.
So I'd like to say that I'm very troubled to see too many parallels to 1992 and even back to 1965, although I was very young at that age, at that time. But I'm so disappointed that the inequities are still so great, and it seems like very little progress has been made. Because racism is so ingrained in our institutions, despite the victories we have had. The perception that things are as bad as they've ever been with police abuse is very demoralizing, even though we know that at least in Los Angeles and California, those with decision-making authority are very different than those who were in power in 1960 and even in 1992. The demographics of people in decision-making roles in our policy are very different. So we are positioned to make change. We just have to stick with it and insist that change happens now that we have people, different people in places of authority, at least here in LA and California.
Chris or Lynette?
Let you know, you want to go, or I can jump in?
You can jump in because I don't know if I'm still on video. I'm having some connectivity issues. I'm only connected by phone at the moment, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
But we can hear you crystal clear. So if you want to go. Okay, I'll just make a comment, which is that I think like a parallel between 92 and today, but it's really kind of a long-standing thread in American history, is this trend of anti-Asian racism. And I think what's, really been, hitting us in the Bay Area pretty hard, but, has been, really impacting the country nationally, was really the tone that was set, under the previous administration around the China virus. And how COVID was being attributed to Chinese people, and how that led to this, furtherance of this idea that Asian Americans will never belong, and Asian Americans will never be a part of the fabric of American society. And that, is coming to light again. There's a new website, Stop AAPI Hate. Stop AAPI Hate, that has documented nearly 3,000 incidents of anti-Asian violence, in the last year. And one of the most recent was the killing of an 84-year-old Thai senior here in San Francisco. So I just offer that to say the picture of American racism is very complex, and Asian Americans, are, while in some cases have achieved high levels of success, are also often on the receiving end of a very American style of racism as well.
And Lynette, did you want to make a final comment on this question?
I'll just say, what Chris just raised was an interesting point, and it's something that I think Antonio touched on earlier. So I want to say this regarding the anti-Asian American sentiment. I think sometimes people get lost in this majority population view or the attempt to change the direction of the conversation from the dominant power to disputes between African Americans and Latinos, or disputes between Asian Americans and Blacks. And so somehow, sometimes people get caught up in the changing of the narrative. And I think we could do a lot more as communities. And I know Antonio doesn't like this idea of communities of color, but I think that we could do more as communities to support each other and support each other's causes. And so that's what I want to say about that particular topic.
Thank you, Lynette. And then one final question, and this is for everybody on the panel. It has to do with just kind of what keeps you going and what keeps you supporting this movement. As I'm sure most of you know, it can, as Chris mentioned earlier, our clients are filled with a lot of trauma, and we end up kind of taking on their trauma vicariously. Additionally, for those advocates of color who we come into this work with our own sets of trauma, there tends to be a feeling of burnout and a feeling that you are constantly working within a system that is just completely and totally unwilling to change. And sometimes it can be hard to continue to stay motivated. So I guess just from everybody, what do you do, or what things can you suggest that can keep people motivated and interested in this work? And I guess I can start with Yolanda.
Wow, so there are a lot of things. Stay positive, try not to give in to negative influences of hopelessness and hate and division. Have goals that are incremental and achievable. Understand and acknowledge personal limits, but don't see them as barriers to continuing the work. Counting on others for support. Collaboration. We can't do it by ourselves. We need the support of our communities need our support, and we need to have the support of others as well. And just give yourself permission to let go sometimes of the stresses and the demands, and to focus on rest and rejuvenation of body and spirit, because we need that to continue to move forward. We need to be at our full capacity in order to continue the fight.
Thank you, Yolanda. Chris, do you want to give us your response?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm just incredibly privileged because I get to be inspired by the work that my organization, Change Lawyers, does every day, which is empowering the next generation. And so I guess I'm just constantly like, just so impressed and inspired and like get recommitted, to the work when I see young people, especially young folks of color who want to become lawyers and who want to become change makers, that, in spite of all the mistakes that our generation and others have made, they keep coming and they're like, we're going to make it better. We're going to make it better. And that is, that's really inspiring to me, and makes me want to double down and, do all that I can to make sure the next generation has the tools that they need to change the system.
Annette? I think you may be on mute. We can't hear you.
I think we should take into consideration some of the experiences of the people who are on the front line. I think we should listen more to what they're experiencing. I think we should listen to what the clients that they're servicing are experiencing. And I think we should make more of an effort to have opportunities available. What I don't see, and maybe it's just because I don't actually work for a legal services organization like LAFLA, I'm just not aware of things that are consciously done to make sure that attorneys feel like they're in a safe place where they can express what they're feeling, where they can seek assistance if they're feeling overwhelmed. I don't know if those kinds of well-being programs are available, and I think those are the kinds of things that are important for supporting lawyers who work in this area.
Thank you. And last but not least, Antonio.
Can you reframe the question one more time just so I can answer real quick? Because I can't hear you.
Oh, I said essentially what I'm asking is what are some things that you do to keep yourself motivated, or advice that you can give to others to keep them motivated in doing this work? Because obviously having your own trauma and dealing with the trauma of the clients that we tend to advocate for and represent can tend to feel like it's dragging us down a little bit or cause burnout. So I wanted some perspective from you all on what are things that people can do to stay motivated outside of obviously their commitment to this work.
I guess for me, I think it's always about scale. One of the things that I've run into is that when you introduce something as imaginative as reparations, people need it and want it tomorrow. COVID has only exaggerated that. What I tell myself when you look at whether it be the creation and the discussion that ADOS has triggered to the California bill that ADOS led to passing, celebrate the wins and then understand the context of where this nation was 2 years ago. Because I think it's quite interesting at times that you can always look at what hasn't happened versus celebrating what has. And in addition, what I do tell people or tell myself, but people as well, is to control the controllables. We live, and we all live, when I say that, not just the clients, in the middle of a COVID America that has shut down schools, that has reduced work availability, that has changed the things that you would do as stress release, whether go to a bar or go to a movie. And I think one of the things that you have to do is realize that we live in such a transformational time. Now, even add in, you have to understand that it's not just that school went up, it's that people in our cohort as lawyers are the wealthiest people in the city. Largely, you're in a circle of people whose family might have wealth, and not always measuring yourself directly against the individual that's presented to you, but measuring yourself against a reasonable reality of where you came from and how far you've come as from that I guess beginning point. And I think for a lot of people that's kind of hard to do because we're taught to compete, we're taught to look at other people, we're taught not to focus on ourselves. And if ever there's a moment, this COVID-19 moment is the moment to really do some of the inner work that Chris started off with.
Great, thank you all so much for your responses. We do have a few questions. I'm gonna read them off. And then you can feel free to answer them. Some of them are more pointed, so they're to specific panelists, but I'm sure you can all feel free to respond as you wish. First question, Antonio, do you see judicially initiated reparations as a possible alternative to the federal legislation?
I had a chance to meet with Karen Bass for several hours. I believe that I had already thought this before meeting her, but even after meeting her, you're going to need and especially when you look at it in context of how the Supreme Court that we have now for a number of reasons, but you're really going to need this not to come from the courts. It's going to have to come from the people. And the people are going to then have to lean on their legislators, and also the legislators then lean on the president. I don't believe that as it is, HR 40 is the answer. I don't know if we're going to write our own bill, but I do believe that it's going to come out of a legislative body. I do also think that you have to have specific awareness or recognition of, and you don't even have to call it ADOS, the population of Black folks that come from US slavery. It's not rocket science. If you don't want to acknowledge that group, you can't get to reparations at all. And I don't know how we got here, where we're an erased group, but we are here. And I think that you can't even get to those steps without going through legislation, which recognizes ADOS people, Native Black people, whatever you want to call them, and then also moves to then forcing the House, the Senate, and then the president to sign real reparations, let alone apologize for slavery.
Does anybody else have a response they'd like to give to that question? All right. Next question, for movement lawyering to succeed, shouldn't there be a stronger emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration, specifically with social workers? Yolanda?
Yes, I definitely agree. In my last response, I just talked about collaboration. We really do need to have interdisciplinary partnerships, whether it's with social workers, because that is a big part of the need of our communities for social services and other things that can be addressed by social workers, but also, our community members, our politicians. We in order to affect real change, it takes every facet of our community to be involved. Otherwise, it won't work.
Does anyone else have a response for that question? All right. Next question is, what is your view of expanding the licensing for paraprofessionals to increase access to legal services? So I'm assuming that this individual is meaning like paralegals and legal secretaries, expanding the licensing for those individuals in order to expand access to legal services.
My experience right now is that the issue isn't even, and you guys are on the ground, Yolanda, and so you can speak to this. The issue right now is actually COVID-19 has changed the amount of just hearings that are available, specifically civil, but also on the criminal level too. So giving us more, I guess, legal professionals, I don't think moves that process along. Right now, I think the bigger issue is, do we have enough people in these civil hearing agencies? Do we have enough judges? Do we have are we moving along as a system to acknowledge people that are in prison right now, or jail, let me say, and shouldn't be there and are actually waiting for a hearing that hasn't happened yet? I think that we need to, I would look on that side right now with COVID. Generally speaking, probably it is an issue. I guess Yolanda can speak to that more.
So I think Antonio was talking about the fact that COVID has put a hold on a lot of administrative hearings and court proceedings moving forward. But I think what I want to stress about licensing of paraprofessionals is making sure that if we move in that direction, that there is sufficient training and oversight and accountability of those paraprofessionals. We've had experience with notarios in the community who are inexperienced or not held accountable for mistakes that they make. And we want people to have access to the best legal representation that they can get. So we want to make sure that those safeguards are in place.
I'll just add that I think it's a very interesting idea. I know the State Bar of California has a working group looking at licensure of paraprofessionals. I'm not following it too closely, but there is a lot of discussion in California about that. And my understanding was that there was a MacArthur Genius Grant given, I think, 2 years ago to someone who was exploring this issue, because at least in California, there's only one legal aid attorney per 7,000 persons who have a civil legal problem. And so the idea that just getting more lawyers is going to be enough isn't the case, and that there do need to be others who are equipped and under the supervision of lawyers, as Yolanda mentioned, around reducing the justice gap. So I think I think there's something there worth exploring. I think there's a lot of structural issues also to address, that cause the need for so much civil legal aid to begin with. But the last thing that I'll just add, which is not directly on point, but it's something that the Supreme Court of California and the State Bar is now going to be implementing, which didn't get a lot of news, I don't think, last month, but for people who took but failed the California bar exam dating back to July 2015, if they got a score of 1390 or higher, you will be eligible to get a provisional license. And after 300 hours of supervision by a California licensed attorney, you will be able to become a lawyer without having to take the bar exam again. And I think this change will have an estimated impact on about 2,000 people who took the bar exam but didn't get the 1440 pass score. But I think there are going to be a lot of folks of color within this group, because we know that the bar exam has a racially disproportionate impact on bar examinees of color. So it's just another thing that's out there that I'm just kind of spreading the word on.
Thank you, Chris. Next question, I think this is probably more geared toward Lynette's response regarding student loans and managing student loans for students of color who decide to attend law school. The question is, what tools can we pass on to our mentees and the orgs that we were involved in law school, so they can be more aware of student debt and how to manage their loans so they don't make the same mistakes that we did?
Can you slow the question down just a little bit? I didn't catch the first part.
Sure. It is, what tools can we pass on to our mentees and the orgs that you were involved in law school, so that they can be more aware of students, that students can be more aware of student debt and how to manage their loans so that they don't make the same mistakes that others did?
I think it's very important when mentoring students to make sure that they pay attention to those early communications that they get from the law school about their loans, and having conversations with them. There was no particular organization that I worked with prior to starting law school. I just started paying attention to all of the warnings that I was getting in all of the loan paperwork. Everything came with a, you must read this, you must acknowledge that you understand this debt. And so because there were so many warnings being attached, I wanted to read the details about what I was getting myself into. What I realized is that if I was going to take out a PLUS loan, which is not subsidized, I was increasing my debt. And so I had to ask myself, do I really need this PLUS loan? Now, I know people who were taking the PLUS loan because they needed the money, but they were also using the PLUS loan to travel to exotic destinations and buying pets and doing things like that. I think by mentoring students, we should be able to confine them to what the need actually is. And I will say this, I know it's going to be a struggle for some people. I know that it's not going to be easy to limit the amount of loans they take out. But to the extent that a student is able to minimize the number of loans that they take out and plan 3-4 years in advance and what kind of job they're going to pursue and whether or not that job will repay their loans, if they have that information up front, at least they're making an informed decision about how much debt they're incurring, and we can figure it out from there. The other thing I do right now when I mentor students is I tell them all the time, don't rely on a job after law school to help start paying down your debt. If there's an opportunity to get a scholarship, whether it's merit-based or not, always apply for a scholarship, because I think it's important for them to understand that the amount of debt that they carry after law school impacts their ability to buy a home, to buy a car. There's so many repercussions from piling on a lot of debt. And so, that's just, I think my perspective is a little bit different. Some people aren't able to make those decisions. And so, it's a little bit of a different approach, but that's just the way I did it for myself. And that's what I recommend when I mentor students.
Tyler, if I can, we have a student loan debt relief practice at LAFLA, headed by Robin Smith, who is a great nationally known advocate in the student loan world. And one of the activities that her team has implemented that really needs to be expanded is educating students. There has to be a commitment to have that education in high schools, and it has to be a commitment where it's widespread. Every high school should have a counselor who understands, how to counsel people on student debt, or have the resources for outsiders to go in and do education around this issue, because it has to be a widespread commitment.
Chris?
I just wanted to add that there is an organization, a national nonprofit organization called Access Lex, and they have a lot of education for prospective law students and current law students around kind of all the financial issues related to financing your law school education. So I would refer you to their website, Access Lex, great resources. And then one other thing that I just wanted to point out, and this may be relevant if any of you who are listening are employers, that there was an extension of a tax benefit that employers can offer to their employees to pay for law school, or it could be law school debt, but educational debt, up to $5,250 per year with no tax consequence for the employees. So I know in the private sector, this is really catching on as a way to recruit, candidates of color, but then also to address the issue of student debt. So employers out there, please take a look at, I think it's section 108 that was recently expanded to, for being only a 2020 benefit, extended out, I think, until 2025 that employers can do this.
And thank you so much for that resource, Chris. Another question that I think is probably directed toward you, we were talking about trauma-informed lawyering. Someone asked, where can they learn more about trauma-informed lawyering?
Well, I saw that question and I was trying to Google really fast some answers there, because I think it is emerging. I would suggest, okay, you could find what I found on Google, but I will say what I have heard where this is really coming up is with clinical education. A lot of clinical law professors are building this into how they are teaching law students in the clinical context. So I would look there, and I can't remember their name, but there's a Stanford immigration law clinic, and I believe that they are using a trauma-informed model. But on trauma, I would really just highly recommend, I'm just pulling from my library here, this book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. It's just such a super book about understanding the racial trauma of white supremacy that impacts all of us. And he's really just speaking about how trauma, racial trauma lives in the body. And, if we only intellectualize the problem of racism by talking about it, which is what we've done for decades, and we wonder why racism isn't disappearing, even though we understand it so well. If we carry down that road, we're never going to solve the problem. We need to understand the trauma and heal from it as individuals and then more broadly as a country. So My Grandmother's Hands, can't highly recommend it enough.
Thank you so much. We also got a good recommendation in the Q&A section from Patricia Fink, who mentioned the Victims' Rights Law Center in Boston. I'm sure if you Google it, you can find more information on trauma-informed lawyering as well. Next question. How do we address the ongoing trauma inflicted upon the Black community around mass incarceration?
I'll start with that one. I think what I start off with, started my career as a prosecutor, moved into now criminal defense attorney by trade. I don't think people know the numbers. I mean, it starts there because, we all experience, when a family member goes to the prison, whether it be a father or a brother, some impact. But you really have to start with who's going to prison or who's going to jail. And I think our society has been totally dishonest about that. Like I said earlier, what I did for, because I saw nobody doing it, is I took all of the Black men numbers, African-American men, and that includes Black immigrants and Black men. When I say that, Native Black men, and there was about 700,000. And then I looked at the World Policy Institute, and there was about 700,000 women in the whole planet incarcerated, 200,000 being in America. I think 30 or 40 at that time were Black women. This is the whole nation. I think our society hasn't been honest how we got there. And so going to that question, it starts off just having a basic understanding of who's going to jail. Let's move beyond just color. Let's move beyond just gender. And let's start asking the question, who? Because once you get to the who, now you can say the why. And I think that goes to Rodney King and George Floyd. You start realizing George Floyd is in that World Cup. I mean, that Cup Foods with a supposed $20 counterfeit bill. He moved to Minnesota and started off working at a Salvation Army, making $8 an hour or so. And I think one of the things that we don't want to deal with is unpacking how did we get here with mass incarceration. I go back to the documentary Freeway Cracking the System I talked about earlier, and we start talking about crack cocaine and how we sentence crack because that's what young Black and in some cases Latino men were selling versus the cocaine that white men were peddling, that white CEOs were using, that white movie stars were using. I mean, cocaine was on movie item lines in the 70s. That's what people don't even know or remember, let me say. So back to the main guts of the question. I feel like one of the things that we have to do is get honest that this is a direct attack on Black families and Black men particularly. If we don't get honest with that, then we're not going to get to the solution, which is it's not enough just to let them out now. Because now you send them home with COVID or undereducated, you send them home without skills, you send them home without job training in the middle of a COVID America, and you say, well, release is enough. And that's not enough because then grandma, then sister, then mom, all are left with the burden of what a society has done and forgetting a whole population that ties all the way back to slavery and Jim Crow that was literally locked up because we didn't know what to do with them in the 80s and in the 90s. LA represents a very interesting dynamic in and of itself to me because interestingly enough, if you came of age and you were 16 and 17 in Los Angeles, in 72, you had a vastly different opportunity trail than somebody, I'm talking about Black male particularly, that came of age in 82. In 72, there were garbage truck jobs where literally that job could propel you to a strong middle-class life where you owned a home, had a wife and everything else. By 82, we had decided through Reaganomics and trickle down through the lack of opportunity, those jobs had disappeared. We had decided to forget this group. I think that, I guess my answer to that question is I believe we all have to get much more aware and honest about how this all happened and what do the numbers look like? What did they look like and what do they look like today? And why do they look like that? And do we even care? And if we don't care, then we need to say that out loud too.
I wanted to add that how we support individuals coming home from incarceration is very important. Tyler, you know very well that the support that we can provide is extremely important to getting past the trauma. We at LACLA are part of a program called Project Impact, where Tyler is one of our attorneys that helps support individuals with legal services, behavioral health services, employment services to get people, the support that they need to get back their lives and moving forward as quickly as possible. And I think those types of programs really need to be expanded so that everyone has access to them.
Definitely agree, and not to disagree with you, Antonio, specifically around Black men and incarceration. But I do think that often in society and in the conversation about mass incarceration and the trauma that it inflicts on the Black community, we do forget about the women who end up incarcerated and the additional impact that it has on them as Black women in society, in addition to the way that it affects the family structure for Black families. So I just don't want to discount that.
And I don't want
no, I know you weren't trying to discount it. Yeah, and I understand what the numbers say, and again, I think it's just because that's not something that's generally focused on. Like I think about myself being a part of a reentry program, and the reentry programs that we have just in the greater Los Angeles area. There's only one program that is specifically geared toward women who are leaving incarceration. All other programs tend to recruit from and have their messaging directed at men who are coming out of incarceration and kind of addressing the issues and trauma that they have regarding mass incarceration. So I just wanted to add that, not starting an argument.
No, I'm not at all. I just think this is the only thing I say to that point. The reason why is because there are barely any women going to prison. Like, it's just what they did here. I'm talking about by the numbers. I'm saying that the Sentencing Project in October, they released the number of Black women incarcerated now. It's dropped to 83 per 100,000. When you take that against 20 million Black women, that's about 18,000. I don't want more Black women to go to jail. What I'm saying is, if we don't significantly deal with why is it in the same community, this group is going to jail so much, what ends up happening is we don't really address, there is a target. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be programs for all women, all people that go to jail. What I'm saying is there's no way that this number should be so out of whack. And I think we as a society have decided, well, we've been talking about that too long. And because we've been talking about it too long, it needs to just go away. When the number still shows, even after we decreased and we went to anklets, I think that the new numbers have Black men at like 500,000. They're down from like 700 to 500,000 out of the 20 million. I mean, it's insane. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be programs for both groups.
Yeah, and I just want to comment that, I've never been a criminal prosecutor or a criminal defense attorney. I work in-house, I do transactional work, but I do a lot of pro bono, and I have served as a juror on a number of criminal cases. And I will say this, from the first case that I ever sat on as a juror, one of the things that I always wanted to know is, what is the conversation or what kind of assistance is available for people who are arrested, for the Black men who are being arrested, who never go to prison, who never go to jail? Like, to me, that's a traumatic experience. And what are we doing as a society to address what that feels like and what that means and how that makes someone feel and how that makes a Black man or any man who is arrested and how he goes the rest of his life with that stigma? Like, to me, when I think about trauma, I don't just think about it from, the incarceration stage. I think of it through the entire system of from the beginning, the middle, and the end, because I think all of it is traumatic.
Definitely 100% agree with both of you. Just again, wanting to mention that Black women are often left out of the conversation, and we have been focusing a lot on Black men, which again, I do understand it's a problem. I see it every day in the work that I do. So finally, we are out of time. I just want to thank each of the panelists for taking the time out of your day to talk with us about this today. and educate some who may not have had any idea about this work and how they can get involved. For everyone else who is listening, if you are interested, there is an additional panel tomorrow on housing and race equity. It is going to start at 2 p.m., not 3 p.m. tomorrow. So if you are interested, you can, Wednesday, not tomorrow. If you are interested in that, you can sign up on the LAFLA Symposium website. Once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today.